Yo, what's up, YouTube? Hope everybody's having an awesome week, getting ready for the weekend, getting ready for the MH3 release that I believe is like Tuesday on Magic Online, so we're like 5 days out, something like that. Really exciting for that. Really excited for that. So if you aren't following me on Twitter, a lot of what I'm going to show off today is going to be kind of new to you. If you are following me on Twitter, you might have seen some of these deck lists, but not all of them. So for the last few days, especially ever since spoilers got done, I've been working on updating shadow lists with some of the new cards. And so I thought this would be a fun opportunity to kind of go through some lists I'm working on. I think I've got like 9 or 10 of them. Kind of go over what some of the new cards I think are doing, some of the new interactions, things to look forward to, things to look out for, and kind of go from there. Like, show what I've been thinking since the last Big Shadow videos, show what I'm going to be starting with when MH3 drops on Tuesday, if we can get cards available. You know, with like some of the rental services, it might take a couple days before you can actually get stuff. So we'll see what it looks like when the set drops and go from there. Otherwise, these are in no particular order, but I will have thumbnails, or not thumbnails, timestamps over the course of the video. So if there's a particular build you're wanting to know more about, whether that's like Dimir or Grixis or anything, then we'll have it marked where you can just skip straight to that deck list and kind of get an idea of what changes I'm looking at. Now, before I get into some of the lists, remember that none of this is perfect. The new meta hasn't come out yet. Nothing's settled. None of these cards are set in stone. These are just things that I've had experience with in previous Shadow builds that I think might be remedied by some new cards or all new concepts that we'll see how they play out. Sideboards especially. We don't know how sideboards are going to need to look in the upcoming months. We don't know what we're going to need to tech for. So I'll kind of talk about that as different cards show up in the sideboards. But until we know more, don't think of this as the definitive list. Think of it as, hey, here's a starting point that we can at least have like a jumping in list with, or list to jump in with. And then as things start to shape and mold a little bit, then we can adjust. We can kind of fine-tune things a little bit better. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump in. So I did want to start off on Jund Shadow, because this is like my favorite Shadow archetype. I think it does a really good job of mixing being hyper efficient, hyper consistent, with a power level that we don't see in a lot of other aggro decks. You give up the ability to interact as well with like the unfair stuff for the possibility of just rolling through the fair matchups. And what we've seen with Jund Shadow, especially leading up to Thunder Junction, when I kind of took a step back from playing as much, was a lot of the mid-range matchups like Scam, a lot of the control matchups almost felt like a buy a lot of the times. So what we're trying to do with this list is keep a lot of that ability to outgrind other mid-range decks. Keep like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Bowmasters, our big threats with Shadow and Goyf. And then add a little bit more ability to push through damage in the unfair matchups with Nether Goyf, with Inti. As you will notice, I don't have Street Wraith in this build. I think that Inti and Street Wraith is a fine combination, but what I found was Street Wraith was losing me a lot of mid-range and control matchups by just being like essentially a dead card. If you didn't have Shadow, it wasn't doing that much for you. I just wanted to find myself like playing more cards that actually did something more often. And you think of Street Wraith as drawing you into a card that does something, but that's not always the case. Like, sometimes it's drawing you into Thought Seizes, it's drawing you into lands, it's drawing you into second Ragavans, whatever. And then you're just 2 life down, in a lot of matchups where like Lightning Bolt is prevalent, Murktide's flying over, and you can't really afford to give up those life points. So for me, Street Wraith has kind of been a cut from the deck, and since I'm not running Street Wraith, I don't think Dismember is enough of a reason to not want Giganta. So I've cut the Dismembers, Giganta as a companion, get to be more aggressive. Ragavan, Nethergoyf is an inclusion that I'm really excited about in the archetype. Keep the Bowmasters, add in a couple inties to help push through some damage, give your Nethergoyf trample. A 3-2 Ragavan's a lot faster clock than a 2-1 Ragavan at like 3 turns. We get a single copy of Tarfire in here, just a little extra buff for our Nethergoyfs, for our Tarmogoyfs, since we're running 4 of each. But other than that, very proactive, very straightforward. Hit them in the face. Hope they can't recover. Single copy of Battle Rage in the main, one more in the sideboard to hopefully help out in the unfair matchups. In the sideboard, the only real card I'm super interested in out of the new set, sideboard-wise, is Vexing Bauble. And that's because, historically, the pitch elementals like Solitude and Living End have been atrocious matchups. And you could play Chalice of the Void, but Chalice countering your Bauble is kind of weird, but not the biggest deal in the world. Either way, Vexing Bauble is a card that you can play out, and if your opponent does find a way to interact with it, like a Seiju or something, you can just crack it, cycle it, draw a card, so you're not just down a card for playing it out. Nihil Spellbomb, again, to help with things like Living End. Sudden Edict, this is just Edict card. You could play a Shieldred's Edict or a... What's the other one? There's another one. But you could play one of those. Sudden Edict is mostly so that my, like, Scion of Draco opponents can't respond to it with a Stubborn Denial. Just say, like, hey, you got a Scion. Now you don't have a Scion. Pick Your Poison, the go-to green sideboard staple right now for sacking Urza, Sagas, One Rings, whatever else. Toxic Deluge. I don't think Toxic Deluge is going to be like a permanent member of Jund Shadow, but I think with the new set coming out, people are excited to play like Merfolk with Harbinger of the Seas. They're excited to play some of these creature aggro decks. So I think Toxic Deluge is going to be a card that we're going to be more interested in early on, that might kind of fall off as time goes on. And then extra copy of Battle Rage because you want to fight through some of the unfair stuff. One of the big advantages of this deck, I think, that doesn't get spoken about enough, is Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It's a card that I have found extraordinarily good in this archetype for helping against things not only like Blood Moon, Chalice of the Void, helping you ditch some extra cards late, helps in the mid-range matchups, the control matchups. So you just have to understand that, like, this is not the hyper all-in Shadow list. This is the mid-range Shadow list. I did end up cutting the Kroxas, which if it turns out I don't like Inti, then Kroxa is going to be like my first bring back in. I understand the Nombo of Kroxa with Nethergoyf and Tarmogoyf to some extent, but you also just cycle through and see so many cards over the course of a match. I haven't had problems with Kroxa taking me off Delirium, and if I haven't had problems with Kroxa taking off Delirium, then I don't think I'll have problems with Kroxa shrinking Nethergoyf to below a 4/5. And if I'm playing a 1-mana 4/5, like, I'm happy. I don't need that 4/5 to be a 1-mana 6/5. You know what I mean? Like, the difference between a 1-mana 3/4 or 6/7. The difference between a 1-mana 3/4 and a 1-mana 5/6 isn't that much. So don't be like afraid to play good cards at the risk of slightly shrinking your Nethergoyf. Now, I'm not saying go play Nethergoyf in your Rest in Peace deck. Not saying that at all. Just know that you're going to see a lot of cards. A lot of cards are going to go to the graveyard. You don't need to be so worried about, like, lacks of synergies and situations like that. Either way, that's Jund. Go on to the next one. So Grixis. Grixis, next one up. The obvious inclusion that I put here is Nethergoyf over Ragavan, which I'm sure is one that a lot of people are going to question me on pretty heavily. And it's basically because I think that the biggest thing holding back Grixis is the lack of punch, lack of ability to like push through damage, because your heavy hitters are a 1-mana 1/1 that maybe gets +2/+2, and a 1-mana 2/1 that never gets +2/+2, and Bowmaster's a 1/1 strapped to a 1/1 that might become a 2/2, hopefully. And then Shadow. So Nethergoyf with your combination of like Thoughtseize, Lightning Bolt, Mishra's Bauble, fetch lands. Again, getting it up to a 3/4, 4/5, maybe a 5/6 pretty consistently. Really helps give the punch that I think Grixis has been kind of missing. You still have your core of Expressive Iteration, Drown in the Lock, Lightning Bolt, some other removal spells in this case, some Fatal Pushes, Unholy Heats. I do think Fatal Push is going to take a little bit of a buff in the upcoming sets. We're seeing a lot of people playing around with like white-red based aggro decks. I say people, like Aspiring Spike and Young Dingo have been streaming recently. White-red aggros looked really good, white-red mid-range. The Nadu decks, being able to interact with those, which Fatal Push does more consistently than Unholy Heat. Drown in the Lock, I think, solid in those kind of matchups. And you're just going to have to suck it up when you go up against Tron. But that's what we have a sideboard for, which in this case is brimming with some Consigned to Memories. The new counter spell from MH3. For 1 blue, you can counter a colorless spell or a triggered ability. And then it's got Replicate for an additional blue, so you can counter second or third or fourth colorless spell, triggered ability. We've got Kolaghan's Command and Meltdown, because we're expecting a bunch of artifacts. Affinity got some new toys like Kappa Cannoneer. Tron got some new toys. Ugin's Labyrinth with Chalice of the Void, we kind of expect to see a bit of early on. K-Command, Meltdown, Engrath's Rampage, give you some good options to interact with that. Stern Scolding to help out in some of these creature matchups. Cursed Totem, Yawgmoth, still a thing, still going to be around, still need to be able to interact with it. Notably, Cursed Totem only affects your creatures or all the creatures in play. So if you did have Sling in the graveyard with an activated ability, you could still use it. Nethergoyf, however, is not an activated ability. It is an alternate cast cost, so don't worry about Cursed Totem and Nethergoyf. And then Dress Down, really good answer to Saga tokens. Yes, it does shrink your Nethergoyf, but we already had it like shutting off Channeler, shutting off Ragavan. So don't be afraid to play good cards at the cost of a lack of a little bit of center. The only other thing I kind of want to point out, I don't have one in this deck, but I've started trying to incorporate a single copy of some of the Surveil lands in some of my lists. Really depends on how aggressive the list is. Like Grixis, really color intensive, really on. Don't really have a lot of time to take a turn off, but some of the lists like Jund that might be starting off turn 1 nothing, turn 2 Tarmogoyf, and you have a chance to set up a little bit. They'll probably include like a Raucous Theater, the red-black Surveil land, or a lot of the slower blue-black lists have Undercity Sewers. So just want to point that out before we get to any of the lists with them. Other than that, Grixis, pretty straightforward. I think it's a fairly known quantity at this point. I will point out, I do not like Underworld Breach. I don't like that card at all. I haven't liked it. I've never liked it. So if that's a card that you're really interested in playing, I absolutely advise you to continue playing it if you're seeing success with it. I have not enjoyed it. I feel like my matches have been fine without it. Yeah, so probably will not see me playing Underworld Breach unless like another really insane combo option comes up. Either way, that's Grixis. Kind of speed through some of these known quantities to get to some more interesting stuff like Dimir Scam. Another good Nethergoyf home, in my opinion. Mainly because, like, I think Nethergoyf fits in really well in a lot of these shells that are trying to be proactive, even if the proactive thing is kind of combo based and unfair, like scamming a grief. But it does give you the ability to kind of have an alternate play that can proactively impact the board and work towards getting you across the finish line. One of my favorite interactions in the Dimir Scam shell is turn 1 grief being able to enable turn 2 stubborn denial or curve very well into a turn 2 counter spell. So you'll see whenever I do a scam list, I try to put in a bunch of counter spells, a bunch of stubborn denials, just because I think that's a really fun, really powerful interaction. Dolthy is one you can play in the main, or you can be heavier on drown. I kind of just go with both, because I assume if my Dolthy's living, I probably don't need the drown. If my Dolthy dies, then the drown's enabled. It all works out in the end. But those 2 drowns could be like 2 more preordains if you wanted to add a little more consistency to the scam package. Because one of the really good benefits of this scam package is that turn 2 grief is still protected with like stubborn denial or another undying effect. So you still have like a lot of play to a turn 2 scam grief as opposed to just a turn 1 one. But since Nethergoyf is only counting your graveyard, Dolthy exiles their graveyard, you don't have a conflict between those two like you would with Dolthy and, say, Tarmogoyf. But a lot of the list is trying to kind of mirror the Rakdos variations of Scam by somewhat keeping the count of like Ragavan to Nethergoyf, their Fatal Push to our Fatal Push, their Terminates to our Drowns, things like that. It's not a perfect 1-for-1, but you can see a lot of the resemblance. A lot of the inspiration for like number of undying effects comes from Rakdos. The big downside is Rakdos does have access to cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Kroxa and Shieldred that Dimir doesn't really have. So we kind of have to make up for that with our ability to say no with counter spells, stubborn denial, stuff like that. In the sideboard, Harbinger of the Seas is, I think, the big one. Obviously, we've got a couple copies of Toxic Deluge on the board, but Harbinger of the Seas being like an additional 1-for-1 Blood Moon replacement to like the Rakdos scam list. Since we've got 2 swamps in the main deck, we're a little bit more capable of playing around our own Harbinger. The 2 swamps are kind of a nod to Dolthy and Grief. If we didn't have those double Black Pip cards, I'd be okay with just 1 swamp. But since we do, I think the second swamp is kind of a necessity. Also helps play around Blood Moon a bit. But I don't really want to add a second island to play around Blood Moon with counter spells. So you get what you get. 2 Dress Down, 2 Legion's End. Help exile some opposing threats to give us trouble like the Undying things. 4 copies of Spreading Seas. Now, I know this one is very, very aggressive. Like, you could run more Harbingers. I'm a big Spreading Seas proponent, and I really like the idea of starting off with a Scammed Grief on 1, or a Thoughtseize on 1, or a Nethergoyf into a Spreading Seas, and kind of curving out that way. Help deal with Urza's Sagas, help deal with Ugin's Labyrinth, Tron lands that I expect to be really popular early on. So this is just like that turn 2 intermediate play of saying, I'm just going to stop whatever you're doing if I don't have to counterspell. So big on Spreading Seas. We'll see if it ends up getting a place in the upcoming meta, but I'm a big Spreading Seas believer, so I'm going to stay positive nonetheless. Otherwise, a couple extra spot removal spells and another Edict, a Fatal Push to go along with the 2 Legion's End. Really help against decks like Prowess, against opposing Scam decks, against any creature-based deck, really. And then an Unlicensed Hearse on the board. I've already got 4 Dolthy in the main, so I don't really feel like I need to go heavy on the Grave Hate in the board. But sometimes it's nice to have one more piece of interaction, especially one that can't be bolted or unholy heated, or what's the new one? Galvanic something. Can't be hit with the spot removal spells. So that is Dimir Scam Shadow. On to Sultai Invasion. So Sultai Invasion we haven't seen in a while. And part of that was because the list, to a lot of people that were playing it regularly, really felt kind of clunky. The interaction wasn't great, which we did get I can't remember. I think Preordained was unbanned after this deck kind of took its brief rise and fall in popularity. But the big thing is getting access to Nethergoyf now. Like, if you played Sultai Invasion before, or if you came and talked about it on any of the Discords, one of the common themes was you're not a Shadow deck, you're a Tarmogoyf. And that's because you've got, like, not only the fetches, Thoughtseize, Bauble, Wraith, but Battle, the invasions themselves are a new card type, and, like, Street Wraith all help grow your own graveyard, whether your opponent grows their graveyard or not. So you're this deck that really incentivizes putting a bunch of card types in the yard, beating down with Tarmogoyf. And so Nethergoyf is kind of the obvious inclusion from the set to this archetype, because not only does it give you a really powerful turn 1 play, especially with like Wraith, Bauble, Fetch land, you're looking at swinging for 3 or more on turn 2, but it gives you those Tarmogoyfs 5 through 8 to really take advantage of that card type game plan. Now, you could find room to throw in an enchantment or two if you wanted to. Again, I think that Nethergoyf is like a 3-4 is good. Another Goyf is a 4-5 or 5-6 is great. And anything beyond that is just kind of like forcing the issue. But because you're running the Thoughtseize package, these aggressive creatures, Street Wraith, it makes it an obvious Shadow deck as well. Orcish Bowmaster is definitely one of the awkward cards that people have discussed cutting several times. You could find room for the 4th Preordain if you wanted to go. Personally, I like the 2nd Bowmaster because I think having more ways of interacting with cards like the One Ring is pretty important. But if that's not your style, you can very easily replace that. The sideboard really reflects the fact that you're a tutor deck with 1 Hex Parasite, a Haywire Might, a Collector Roof, a Grist. So a bunch of really great invasion targets to go grab. Got a couple Sudden Edicts. Same thing as before. Could be a different edict if you want. Mostly just a placeholder. Figure Poison, same as Jund. Terra Sunder, a card that I really, really love. I know some other people don't care for it as much, but I think the versatility of being able to kick it, take out whatever threat you need to is really nice. Or just keep it at 2 mana, take out Ensnaring Bridge, Wormcoil Engine, take out like Urza's Saga, stuff like that. And then Consigned to Memory, we've seen pop up in every blue list. But if you haven't seen the invasion list, the idea here is that you're tutoring up a Vampire Hex Mage, as you can see in like the top right corner. So an invasion on 4 goes and gets a Vampire Hex Mage. Hex Mage enters in. You can sack the Hex Mage to remove all the counters off the invasion. Immediately flip it into an 8/8 that says, I think it's an 8/8 with reach, and it says that combat damage that you deal can be dealt as if your creatures weren't blocked, so you can just straight attack through. Makes it really good into creature-based matchups where chump blockers are a problem. Now all of a sudden your Shadows, your Tarmogoyfs, Nethergoyfs, whatever, your 8/8 are able to just freely attack in without having to worry about a crack back if you have lethal damage on board. So kind of a case of if you're checking your math at all times, then you may be able to kill your opponent out of nowhere. The cool part about Invasion is it does say you search your library or your graveyard. So if you sack a Hex Mage to take out the counters on an invasion, you can use your next invasion to tutor that Hex Mage from your graveyard and then do the same thing again. So really cool to be able to chain like that. Other than that, not really anything else new. Consign and Nethergoyf, really the big pickups for Invasion. But it's another list that people have been excited about on like the Metacord because it is a very proactive, linear style of Shadow. Like, get your dudes out there, turn them sideways. Here's this Temur Battle Rage-esque pseudo combo kill with Invasion. And if a deck like Yawgmoth is extremely popular in the upcoming meta, then this is a great way to fight through that by saying, hey, I don't care about your Undying threats. I don't care about your Grist tokens. I've got a big board. I'm just going to swing through for lead. That is Sultai Invasion. Okay. Here's one that I'm excited about. Maybe more so than a lot of other people. But Tamiyo, Inquisitive Student, a new 1-drop from Modern Horizons 3. It's a 0/3 flyer. Whenever it attacks, you investigate. When you draw your 3rd card into turn, exile Tamiyo, then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. So she flips into a Planeswalker. It says, I think, like, tick up 2 loyalty. Creatures that attack you or Planeswalkers you control get -1/-0. Don't care. -3. I think she flips with 2. -3, you can return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. And then -7, I believe. Sounds right. You draw half of your library and you get an emblem to where you have no maximum hand size. That's the part. That third line of text on Tamiyo is the one I'm really interested in with this build. We've seen some lists showing up with Tamiyo as like a value engine. Like, oh, you attack, nobody's blocking a 0/3 flyer, nobody has anything to block a 0/3 flyer, so you just get a free clue every turn. That's cool. Not what this deck is doing. This deck is turbo flip Tamiyo. And some of the interactions we have to really do that are like turn 1, Tamiyo plus a Mishra's Bauble. Crack a Bauble on your turn, go to my turn, draw my upkeep for Bauble, draw for turn, that's 2 draws, attack with Tamiyo, make a clue, crack the clue, 3 draws, flip the Tamiyo on turn 2. Bauble can be replaced with Street Wraith in that scenario, so to where you can just attack, or draw for turn on your 2nd turn, attack, make a clue, crack the clue, draw your 2nd card, cycle Street Wraith, draw your 3rd, flip your Tamiyo. And if you flip her on turn 2 and start ticking her up, then she's ulting on turn 5, which means you've got 3 or 4 turns to protect her with like Counterspell, Drown in the Lock, your removal spells, and be able to win the game with her ultimate, because I'm assuming, again, this hasn't been tested in live matches yet, but assuming that if you can ult your Tamiyo on turn 5 and draw half of your deck, you can find some way to win from there. Like whether it's interacting with everything your opponent does and just overwhelming them with card advantage, or finding a quick shadow with double stub backup, something like that. Can find some way to get across the finish line. So I think Tamiyo is going to be pretty cool for giving that a shot. The backup option is Tamiyo as a mid-range kind of value threat. Attack, make some clues, draw some extra cards, maybe eventually flip her with like a Preordained Consider combination. Originally I had Ledger Shredder in here. It was like, oh, you Tamiyo, and then the next turn you draw a card, and you play a Ledger Shredder and a Bauble, and you connive for Shredders, drawing a card, and then you Street Wraith, and you draw and flipper. But I was just like really underwhelmed with Ledger Shredder itself. I've always disliked Ledger Shredder in these builds, and I don't think it does enough to help Tamiyo, especially when the Preordains and Consider package already works to the advantage of cards like Murktide Regent, by being able to set up a big Murktide, being able to find those counter spells to protect it, find interaction to give you time to set up that big Murktide or big Shadow. So I am interested in this build. The other new card, Sink into Stupor, is a 1-of in this list. Kind of Otawara number 2, gives you the ability to interact with things like Chalice of the Void, spells on the stack. You do need to notice that it is return a spell instead of counter a spell. So like Supreme Verdict, you can just return it to their hand instead of worrying about countering it, and it says though it can't be countered. Same thing with Cavern of Souls targets. So if Eldrazi becomes popular, Sink into Stupor, your Thought-Knot Seer or whatever could be relevant. The rest of the deck, Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, pretty known quantity. I did have to trim the Bowmasters because I wanted to fit in this Street Wraith Bauble package. Now, I will 1000% admit this list is not optimal against Bowmaster. I'm kind of hoping that the Bowmasters are going to be on a little bit of the back seat as the new meta kind of shakes out a little bit. That being said, don't Tamiyo ult into potential Bowmasters. If you think your opponent's got a Bowmaster, do something else. Or rely on the fact that you've got 4 Counterspell, 2 Drown, 3 or 4 Fatal Push, however many, Dismember, stuff like that to fight through Bowmasters. Or just play out a big Murktide and ignore the Bowmaster. But I'm hoping that the play patterns will be such that you're not forced onto your back foot to just like fire off all these draw spells into Bowmaster. Use some judgment. And the sideboard, Inside the Memory, we've seen a billion times by now. Stern Scolding, Cursed Totem, Spreading Seas. Force Negation was a big one I wanted to add to this list because I think it gives you a little bit better ability to protect Tamiyo on the first couple turns. And then it's a really, really great card to hit with the Tamiyo ult because now you have half your library in your hand. Free spells look so much better when you've got all the blue cards in the world to pitch to them. Harbinger of the Seas, Brazen Borrower is another way to bounce things like Chalice of the Void, because this deck with 4 Consider, 4 Preordain, 4 Shadow, 4 Tamiyo, 3 Fatal Push, Dubs, it is very susceptible to Chalice of the Void on 1. So having an extra answer to that's nice. That's also another good plus on Force Negation. So yeah, that's about everything with Dimir Tamiyo. But I will say that, like, goldfishing with this list, based on having Tamiyo in my hand on turn 1, you got to think, like, Tamiyo plus Street Wraith or Bauble and 2 lands is all you need to flip her on turn 2. Or Tamiyo, 2 lands, Preordain, Consider. Some combination of Preordain, Consider, or Preordain, Consider, and Street Wraith. So, like, if you have that turn 1 Tamiyo, the odds of flipping her on turn 2 are absolutely astronomical. Like, I don't know how to describe the consistency without giving some sort of just hyperbolic the right word there. Some sort of number that I know isn't accurate, but trying to get the point across. I'd probably say it was a good 80% that if I had turn 1 Tamiyo, I could flip her on turn 2 without much effort. And when I say without much effort, I mean, like, I've got 2 draw spells and another land in hand instead of, oh, I've got Preordain and no second land and I need to find a land. Like, she was just naturally flipping on turn 2 very large percentage of the time. So really excited about that. I do have to stress, though, this list is only if you're like me and you think Tamiyo's ultimate is a viable win condition. If you don't think the ultimate is a viable win condition, then you're more than welcome to just slaughter into like normal Dimir Shadow lists, user as a value engine. That is completely fine. This is 100% built to test the limits of flipping her as soon as possible and winning with that. That being said, I have also had games where I goldfish like on the draw, turn 1, draw your card for turn, Tamiyo, Wraith, flip Tamiyo. Now she's ulting on turn 4, and yeah, pretty sweet. So keep that in mind. Not the value grind them out Tamiyo build. Combo, flip, draw your whole deck, Tamiyo, half your deck. What do we got next? Ooh, Nulldrifter. Nulldrifter dress down. So in the metacord, like, Bench Summers really pushed for Nulldrifter dress down. Ben Jones was posting on Twitter about Nulldrifter dress down. This was kind of my in-between list. There were some parts I liked from some lists, some things I didn't like. I'm not a fan of Tamiyo in the deck, and I'm not a really big fan of Thing in the Ice, period. So I didn't want to put Tamiyo in. I thought we had better stuff to do on turn 1 with like Preordained setting up, Thoughtseize. Turn 2, Dress Down. Turn 3, Nulldrifter seemed better than Thing in the Ice. So regardless, that's kind of the direction I went. But if you haven't seen this interaction, Dress Down, as you know, the flash enchantment from Modern Horizons 2 lets you draw a card, creatures lose all ability. So the idea is the end of your opponent's turn 2, you drop down to Dress Down, draw your card, go to your turn, evoke Nulldrifter. So Nulldrifter is a cast trigger to draw 2 cards instead of original Nulldrifter where it's enter the battlefield, draw 2 cards. So Dress Down does not stop that cast trigger. Dress Down only affects the things that are on the battlefield, not the abilities in hand. So you still get to draw your 2 cards. The evoke trigger goes away. No evoke trigger because Dress Down removes the abilities. So now you have a 4/4, just vanilla 4/4 on the battlefield. Then when that Dress Down goes away, when you sack it at the end of your turn, all of a sudden your 4/4 becomes a 4/4 flyer with Annihilator 1 for 3 mana. So in a perfect world, Dress Down on 2, redraw a card. Nulldrifter on 3, draw 2 cards, have a 4/4 flying Annihilator 1 for 3 mana. And then be able to start attacking after that. Protect it with counterspell, stub, Thoughtseize, whatever you fancy to keep your Nulldrifter around. But worst case scenario, it is still like replace itself and draw a card on turn 3 if you don't have Dress Down. The other interaction, Dress Down and Thing in the Ice, if you Dress Down and then while it's on the battlefield, resolve a Thing in the Ice, the thing comes in with no counters on it. You still have to cast another instant or sorcery to trigger it to flip and bounce everything. But 1 instant or sorcery cast is a whole lot easier than 4 instant or sorceries cast. So into their turn 2, play a Dress Down, go to your turn 3, drop a Thing in the Ice, then play a Thoughtseize or Preordain, Consider, whatever the case may be. And you get to just flip over that thing and start going to town. Some of the other cool interactions, Consign to Memory. You can use it to counter your own, to like stifle your own evoke trigger on Nulldrifter. So you cast it, you draw the 2 cards, you drew into a Consign to Memory. Oh, sweet. Evoke trigger on the stack. I'm going to consign to memory that evoke trigger and keep around my my 4/4 flying Annihilator 1. You can also use it to counter like the flip trigger on Thing in the Ice when the last counter is removed. If you've got Shadows on board or Nulldrifter or whatever and you don't want it to flip, you have that option. One of the other fun ones we talked about today was into your turn, Dress Down, into their turn, Dress Down, untap. At the end of your turn, when the Dress Down trigger to sack it goes on the stack, you can consign to memory the Dress Down. And now all of a sudden you just have 13/13 Shadows, or you can evoke a Nulldrifter at that point, keep it around. You don't get the flying in the Annihilator 1, but you still have a 3 mana 4/4 that drew 2 cards, and assuming that's going to be better than a bunch of your opponents' like ability-less creatures. With Thing in the Ice, you would never get to flip it, just be a 0/4, but hopefully the Nulldrifter Shadow part of it would kind of work everything out. Just a funny little interaction that you need to be aware of if you decide to roll with this deck. In the sideboard, Consigned to Memory, Disruptor Flute was one I thought kind of fit this build a little bit more because you are playing instant speed with Dress Down. So Disruptor Flute having flash, allowing you to flash in, name a card with an activated ability you don't want to deal with, or just making something pricier, is a pretty cool little trick. Some Stern Scoldings, an extra Stubborn Denial, 3 Harbingers, 1 Spreading Seas. Again, these are numbers that I'm kind of messing around with on a deck-by-deck basis. If you think Spreading Seas is better, run more Spreading Seas. If you want to go 4 Harbinger of the Seas like bench, then run 4 Harbinger of the Seas. 3 Toxic Deluge, because this is more of like a control shadow build and less of an aggro Ragavan, Bowmaster kind of shadow build. Toxic Deluge does look a lot better here, kind of clearing the board. And since I'm lower on Thing in the Ice in the main, I wanted to go higher on Toxic Deluge in the sideboard. So yeah, that is Dimir, the Dimir Dress Down Nulldrifter build. Might be one you see in the leagues early, especially if you run into Bench Summer or Ben Jones a lot. Next we have got Sultai without Invasion. So the big difference between the Sultai with Invasion, Sultai without Invasion, is this one is definitely more of a Death Shadow deck. The other one's more of a Tarmogoyf deck. Traverse being one of the key differences here. Instead of trying to Invasion for a target, we will just Traverse it up. And in this case, I think the big draw is the card 6 from the new set from Modern Horizons 3. This 2 and a green, 2/4 legendary tree folk. With reach, whenever it attacks, you mill 3 cards. You can put a land from among them into your hand. As long as it's your turn, non-land permanents in your graveyard have retrace. So you can discard a land in addition to paying their mana cost and be able to cast that thing from your graveyard again. So in this particular instance, like retrace allowing you to recast Shadow, Nethergoyf, Bowmaster, Tarmogoyf, Street Wraith, and extreme circumstances. Mishra's Bauble, Seal of Removal, one that I included in the list because not only is it an enchantment for Nethergoyf and Tarmogoyf, it is a non-land permanent kind of removal spell for 6 to be able to retrace that, bounce some stuff like Urza Saga token or Murktide Regent back to hand. And there is no limit on 6. So if you do have like 3 lands in hand, you could retrace Seal of Removal 3 times. You could retrace Bauble 3 times. I do think there are going to be shells that are more able to utilize 6, like Jund maybe with Ren in 6. But I do think this kind of plays the role of Luris in previous 4-color builds where you're able to tutor it up late, drop it down, and then immediately start getting some graveyard value by just getting back like a Bauble, another threat or something, and kind of curving like that. It's also a little bit more difficult to kill than Luris since it doesn't die to Lightning Bolt or an unrevolted fate, or not unrevolted fatal push, non-delirium unholy heat. You know what I'm saying? So this is a little bit more on the mid-rangey side of things. I could see the shell not playing Street Wraith, like maybe not Street Wraith or Nethergoyf, and going harder on the Ren, or harder on the 6 synergy by getting some more ways to get extra cards in hand or just get lands back. But I really wanted to focus in on making Nethergoyf and Tarmogoyf very viable threats and not just sit back on 6. Sideboard, Consign to Memory, Pick Your Poison. A lot of these cards you see are overlapping pretty heavily, and it's mostly because they are the best options at what they do. Consign to Memory, if we're expecting a lot of Tron early on, a lot of Eldrazi Tron, then Consign is a very, very good card to have access to. Just strictly upgraded Ceremonious Rejection. And there are a good bit of triggers that you can respond to, like protection triggers from the One Ring. You can respond to triggered abilities from things like Leyline Binding, Evoke Elemental. Bunch of cool stuff. Flips from Fable of the Mirror Breaker. So there will be a lot of usefulness for the card. Pick Your Poison, same thing, like the most efficient thing. We have it interacting with a lot of cards like Dragon's Rage Channeler, Murktide, Urza Saga, Amulet of Vigor. We've got Stern Scoldings, Curse Totem, Terrace Under, Hurkyl's Recall. Again, expecting a bunch of affinity early on, especially with Kappa Cannoneer. So Recall, a nice little option to have just to kind of flip your board back. Recall, I do think, is a lot better in the lists like this that have the potential to one-shot your opponent. Because if you recall and they're able to just rebuild because you don't really have a clock or a way to get the game over with, then it's a lot less exciting. But in a deck like this with Nethergoyf, a Goyf, and a Shadow or something, you can probably just swing in for lethal immediately after the recall. And then Toxic Deluge, in it a million times. Kind of get the idea at this point. So yeah, that's Sultai with 6. I could definitely see another copy of 6 if you went heavier on that synergy. but I don't know how well the one copy is going to do right now, so I don't want to start adding like a bunch of copies when I'm not sure how one would even feel. Up next is Rakdos. So I talked about earlier Jund not being like the aggressive all-in shadow build. Rakdos is not that. Rakdos is the aggressive all-in shadow build. Hence why we've got the 4 Street Wraith, the 4 Mishra's Baubles, the Shadows and the Nethergoyfs, the NTs. We're trying to push through damage. We're trying to be aggressive, trying to be proactive. I do not like Scourge of the Skyclaves, but with the addition of like Tarfires and Seal of Fire in here, which I added strictly for Nethergoyf, you might be able to get Scourge on a little more online if you wanted to run it over, say, Bowmaster. But I'm still not a fan of it. I think the interaction for Bowmaster is still nicer in the long run. But Scourge is really, really nice with Temur Battle Rage. Maybe you want to find a couple spots for him over like an Unholy Heat. I don't know, Unholy Heat and a Fatal Push or something. But again, I think with NT being around, Scourge is a little less necessary since you give your Goyfs trample, your Shadows trample, grow your Ragavan, grow NT itself, whatever the case may be. But this is like the Battle Rage list. This is the get your opponent dead, ASAP, don't really care what they're doing kind of list. I have said on numerous occasions, don't play Seal of Fire, don't play Tar Fire. They're bad burn spells. With the asterisk, don't play those until you have maxed out on Lightning Bolt. You can go check any video that I've ever said about Sealed Fire and Tar Fire. They have all included that statement. Don't play them over Lightning Bolts. In addition to is a completely different story. We've got our maxed out bolts. We've got our reach with those. We've got the ability to pump Shadows in combat, Nethergoyfs in combat, whatever. Clear out blockers. Now we've added a couple Tar Fires and a Seal of Fire on top of that to help out with Nethergoyf. And just clear the way for things like Ragavan. Help fight opposing Bowmasters or Greed. Anything to that effect. But the rest of the deck is just turn them sideways, get them dead. Like the Bauble Street Wraith interactions with fetch lands, you've all seen a million times if you're watching this video. So being able to curve out should be pretty consistent. NT is sort of Battle Rage 3 and 4, but Battle Rage is still Battle Rage. You have to understand that when people start comparing cards like NT to Battle Rage and saying, oh, it gives your guy trample, it gives him +1/+1 in trample. That's huge. That's great. It's not Battle Rage. Battle Rage doubling the power and giving trample is what makes Battle Rage Battle Rage. So being able to one-shot your opponent from 19 damage that NT can't do. Really big deal. So don't think of NT as just like your straight up replacement for Battle Rage. Think of it as a more value-oriented, lower ceiling Battle Rage. Fatal Push could be out of here pretty easily. Mostly I just wanted to keep it in because if Prowess is popular, Fatal Push is the best removal spell that we have against Prowess, since there is the chance they can outgrow Lightning Bolt, Unholy Heat with cards like Mutagenic Growth, and especially Tar Fire and Seal of Fire. Those cards are very easy to outgrow. So if you're already being hyper aggressive with your life total, you've got to be either be able to one-shot with Battle Rage or be okay spending a couple spells, getting rid of a Prowess threat. In the sideboard, Meltdown for the Affinity decks. Seeing a couple copies of Blood Moon. I am really high on Blood Moon and Rakdos because, for the most part, one swamp, you can play everything you need to play. Hard casting Street Wraith is the only thing that you can't do in the matchups that you want Blood Moon. So having 2 swamps, maybe you see them, maybe you don't, but as long as you see one, fetch it out on like turn 3, you should be fine. 4 copies of Dauthi Voidwalker gives you Grave Hate while allowing you to stay proactive, which is extremely important. You don't want to turn 1 Nethergoyf, turn 2 not advance your board and play out like an unlicensed hearse. Dauthi gives you the ability to go turn 1 Goyf, turn 2 Dauthi, keep being proactive, keep pressuring the board. And then Winter Moon was a card that I wanted to try out against some of the unfair land-based decks, the Trons, Amulet Titans, all that. I don't know how good it'll be, but the hope here is that if you get like a basic swamp early, maybe you've gotten a Blood Crypt or two, you're always going to have that swamp untapped, and then a Blood Crypt untapped should let you cast everything under the sun. So I don't see Winter Moon being a card that like really impacts our mana base much. Same way Blood Moon is something we can play around ourselves as long as we plan for it. Kroxa help out some of the mid-range matchups. I prefer a second Kroxa, but we'll have to see how the meta shakes out to find out where I'm going to put that. Toxic Deluge, again, I don't think this is necessarily the best deck for Toxic Deluge, but I expect a bunch of aggressive creature decks early on. And even just like Deluge, keep your Nethergoyf Shadow around is a pretty big deal. Vexing Bauble helps out with decks like Living End. I know we have 4 Dolthy Voidwalker, but still, Living End is very problematic. The Evoke Elementals like Solitude are very problematic. And Vexing Bauble offers you a very unique ability to sacrifice that card and replace itself if you're not taking full advantage of that counter something if no mana was spent on it. So that's Rakdos in a nutshell. Very aggressive, very straightforward. Ooh, Orzov. So I saw somebody top 64'd, I think, one of the challenges with Orzov Shadowblade. We've played like Mardu Shadowblade before and Esper Shadowblade, and they're really, really fun decks. To say the least. I thought Orzov looked pretty straightforward. There's a lot of cards that they were playing that I'm not as high on, so I did change some things around. I'll kind of go over those. For example, their list had Giver of Runes. I've never been a huge fan of. I don't like the fact that it's a card that doesn't do anything by itself. It has to be paired with another thing. Ranger Captain of Eos. I'm not huge on. I think that like a turn 4 Shadow is just too slow. Like if you're going turn 3 Ranger Captain, turn 4 Shadow. I think Ranger Captain was an exceptionally good card when Mardu Shadow was around during the Hogak era, and you were able to Faithless Looting, ditch a Ranger Captain, ditch a Tide Hollow Skull or whatever, and unearth it. And get like that turn 2 interaction, turn 3 Shadow, and go from there. I don't think that I think without Faithless Looting Unearth, that card gets so much worse in Shadow builds that I'm basically like not interested in playing it at all. But I can understand that if you think there's going to be a meta of like a lot of Living End, a lot of Rhinos, things like that, it gets a lot better. Are able to stop some of those effects. In this build, though, Nethergoyf being the new card coming out to pair with Wraith Bauble gives us another really good proactive 1-drop into Stoneforge. Bowmasters makes a couple bodies. Shadow always a popular aggressive threat. Stoneforge great for finding Huldra Complete. Our swords, Lava Spur Boots, another card that was not around the last time we played this archetype. So for 1 mana. You can give a creature, or 1 mana artifact, equip for 1. Equipped creature gets +1/+0, haste, and ward 1. Really good for hasting up a Shadow, a Nethergoyf, anything like that. It can also just like add a little extra power to like a Huldra Complete. Also lets you equip with a sword. So like Sword of Feast and Famine and Lava Spur on top of that, and all of a sudden you're attacking him with a hasty 2/2 or +3/+2 pro black, pro green dude that untaps all your lands and makes this ditch a card. It's kind of taking the place of what's the name of that card? The 1 red Fervent Champion, the red 1-drop from Mardu Shadowblade that hastes up or has haste, and you can like equip him for free. Lava Spur is kind of the replacement for that, letting you haste up some of your threats whenever you get a chance. As far as the rest of the main deck here, Prismatic Ending, fantastic catch-all removal spell. Also helps deal with things like Chalice of the Void. We've got a Blood Crypt in the mana base to help cast Prismatic Ending for 3 if we need to. But for the most part, you're looking for Nethergoyf, Stoneforge, Shadow, Cauldron Complete, and like the majority of matchups just to push through damage as quickly as you can. In the sideboard, 4 copies of Dauthi Voidwalker because this is Grave Hate that gets to hold a sword. That's really sweet. So 4 Dauthi, 4 copies of White Orchid Phantom, another new card from Modern Horizons 3. It's white and white. I think it's a 2/2 with flying and first strike. When it enters the battlefield, you destroy a non-basic land, and its owner gets to search its library or search their library for a basic land, put it into play. So against Tron and Amulet Titan and stuff like that, it's going to be ETB, blow up one of your fancy lands. You get to search for a basic, but it's also a flying first striker that holds a sword really well. So strap it up with a Sword of Feast and Famine, Sword of Fire and Ice, whatever. Get some damage in. Got an Unlicensed Hearse, again, another non-boltable form of Grave Hate. Turok Dread Cantor, really good against the mono white decks to ditch a couple cards and hold a sword. And a Batterskull. So whenever I play any Shadow deck with equipment, I always include either a Batterskull or a Shadow Spear. And people always say, oh, it's a Nombo with Shadow. It makes it so your shadows die. And that's great. I get it. But it's also a free win card against a lot of decks. Like you drop a Batterskull off of Stoneforge against Burn or against Prowess, and they're probably not going to beat you. Those are historically kind of rough matchups for us. So don't think of it as a Nombo with Shadow. Think of it as a one-card win con that's tutorable against some of these more aggressive decks. So keep that in mind. Don't just like throw out all the possibility of a life gain card, especially when you have 4 Stoneforges to tutor it up. One of the other cards, I believe the person that played the challenge had was Maul of the Skyclaves. It's the 3 mana artifact, I think, that gives like flying and +2/+2. That one's fine. I just replaced it with Lava Spur Boots because I thought the haste and the ward was a little bit nicer. But I can understand wanting to play the Maul instead. Is it Maul or Maul? M-A-U-L? But yeah, other than that, that's about it for black, white. I was kind of messing around with a Mardu list with maybe Ragavan or Dragon's Rage Channeler. I know someone in the Metacord was talking about the new Ajani makes 2 bodies, and then if your cat token dies, you get to flip the Ajani, and then if you've got Ragavan or Embercleave or something out, you can start like making cats and pinging stuff off, which is pretty cool. But it does require you to have other red permanents, which means like Ragavan, Darcy, Seal of Fire. That's about it. So the options are kind of limited on getting that active. But if you can, it's cool. This is, Golgari. Golgari Saga Shadow. We've played it a few times. There are some videos on YouTube if you want to go check those out. Pretty fun deck. The idea, as always, is to be a green-black base Shadow deck, but we get the addition of having Urza Saga, which lets us not only make some extra constructs in matchups where our threats might be held at bay by like sweepers, by really good spot removal, but it allows you to tutor up pretty flexible cards like Nihil Spellbomb, Lava Spur Boots in this case, Haywire Might, Stone of Eric, Pithing Needle out of the sideboard, things like that, to give a little more interaction when we might not be able to have as many copies. So Urza Saga giving essentially 5 copies of, say, Pithing Needle. Get the actual one, and then 4 Urza Sagas against decks where Pithing Needle is really important. Really cool. Or being able to tutor up a Haywire Might against Leyline Binding deck. Get the idea. But the rest of the deck, again, it's another home for Nethergoyf with Wraith, Bauble, the fetch lands, Saga itself, a lot of these random other artifacts, Thoughtseize. But we're still an aggressive, proactive deck. We've got Shadow, Goyf, Nethergoyf, We want to hit them in the face. We want to turn dudes sideways as often as possible. Again, like I said, for the battle, or the, what's it called? The Batter Skull in the last list. We do have a Shadow Spear in here. Yet again, it's because a Saga with a couple constructs and a Batter Skull, or a Shadow Spear, or a Goy for the Shadow Spear, or something like that, is just a free win in a lot of matchups. So don't key in on the Nombo with Shadow. If you got a Shadow out and you don't want your Shadow to die, don't equip the Shadow Spear. But you can always like throw the Shadow Spear on the side, whatever. I just think it gives you a lot of free wins. I wouldn't leave home without it. But again, this is my take on it. If you've got other ideas, then go with your ideas. This is a Traverse deck, because Traverse lets you get not only Urza's Saga and your threats, but some sideboard hate pieces like Turok, Haywire Mite, Collector Oof. It lets you tutor up a Seiju on a whim. So you do have a lot of options for flexibility in your Traverse targets. It'd also be nice to tutor up a Street Wraith to grow a Shadow, tutor up a Fetch Land if you got 2 Shadows, anything like that. Really cool options to nab. Terra Sunder, one of my favorite versatile cards. I think I already talked about that one in the previous list, so I won't go over it too much. The sideboard, yeah, Shieldred's Edict, again, whatever edict choice you prefer. This is more just like my answer to things like Scion of Draco. In the sideboard, a couple engineered explosives to go along with any of the go wide matchups that you're expecting to see. Should probably find room for one more off-color shock land in here, but haven't thought about it that much. I used to run a, what's it called, Springleaf Drum in here, and that kind of helped out with EE, but I think just like an off-color shock would be fine. 2 Turok, 3 Pick Your Poison. Hey, only 3 Pick Your Poison instead of 4 because we got Haywire Mites and Terra Sunders. Stone of Eric, tutor target off Saga, Pithing Needle, Collector Roof, Terra Sunder, a second Terra Sunder, 2 Toxic Deluge, and a Choke. For Toxic Deluge in this list, Shadow, Goyf, Nether Goyf all kind of outgrow it, so I think it should be fine. Construct tokens are more than likely going to be 3/3s, 4/4s, maybe 5/5s, so it should be okay there. And then Choke in the end of the sideboard. I always like Choke in the non-blue list. Wouldn't be opposed to a second copy. It's really good against the Leyline of the Guild Pack decks. It's good against the Dryad of the Elysian Grove decks like Titan. Can definitely get some of your blue-white control opponents. So keep that one in mind if you're looking for an extra sideboard slot in any of your non-blue shadow decks. I think that's about it for Golgari. Again, Nether Goyf, like the big pickup. Lava Spur Boots, just a Thunder Junction pickup. Deluge in the board. Yeah, it looks about right. You could try out the Shifting Woodland too. The land that you pay 2 and 2 green if you have Delirium and copy something in your graveyard. I think it's okay, but I think for a deck like this, if you have 4 mana, you're probably just like casting another threat. If you have something big and unfair like a lockout piece you can get in your graveyard, then that would make it a little bit better. But for the most part, there's not going to be a lot of times where you're going to be copying like a Goyf in the yard. That being said, if you have an extra land slot and you really want a green land, it's probably kind of free just to throw one in there and see what happens. This was like the slightly more mid-rangey Rakdos list that I just included Fable the Mirror Breaker in over like Seal of Fire and something else. It's 95% of the same cards. I was just thinking about if I wanted to go a little bit bigger and find room for Croxa or Fable the Mirror, stuff like that. And that is it. That's all of our shadow lists that I've posted on Twitter so far, as well as a couple bonus ones. And we'll have some more lists coming out. One of the big ones that I'm hoping y'all in the comments can help me out with is I'm trying to find out a way to put together an energy shadow list. Since everybody's asking about the new Amped Raptor. So if you got some suggestions on that, cards you think would be good, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope maybe some of these lists inspired you to try something when the new set comes out. Other than that, come check out a live stream. As soon as the set drops, we're going to be playing games pretty regularly. So if you're a big fan of Shadow, if you want to see some of the new cards in action, come say hey, see what's going on. Give some suggestions and feedback as always. Otherwise, link down below to the Discord if you want to come talk about cards. Link to the Twitter if you want to see some of these new lists going live over there before we actually play them. And I think there's another list or link, but I can't think of what it was. So we'll just call it there. Hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day. Have a great time. Enjoy some good food and company. Have a good weekend. Catch y'all back later. Adios for now.